All right, we're ready for Job 6 to 9 in our survey as we're making our way through, finishing up some things in the Old Testament, and then hopefully this next year we'll finish up our complete study of the Bible. This is our outline of the book of Job that we're following, three major sections. There's the prologue, the dialogue, and the epilogue, and that is the testing of Job that we covered last time, and then we went on into chapter 5. Where Job was this faithful man, and then he lost all of his possessions, and he lost his children, and then ultimately then in the next test he lost his health, as you recall. Then having seen that, Job started into this, in the dialogue. Job's friends came, I must mention, and we mentioned last time the best thing they did was sit there for 7 days in silence. They didn't say anything, and that was the best work they did, the most comforting thing they could do. Job then started this dialogue, and that is with this lamentation in chapter 3, and then chapter 4 starts the first cycle of speeches going through his friends. One of them would speak, then Job, then one of them would speak, then Job, and another one would speak, then Job. Then we go through a second cycle, and then a third cycle, and then there's this interlude. So we're looking at the first cycle. Now, from last week, Job started this discussion after the 7 days of silence by basically lamenting the day of his birth and lamenting the fact that he was still alive. And he said basically three things. I wished I had never been born. Since I was born, though, I wished I'd died at birth. And since I didn't die at birth, I wished I could die now. Well, his friends didn't like that. And so that started this cycle of speeches. So Eliphaz spoke up and thought he'd have something to say. Now let's stop and footnote again and make this point, that sometimes in our reading of this, we're quite critical of these men, and they were wrong in what they said. But these were good, godly men. These are not wicked men. These are not false teachers in the sense that they're trying to mislead someone. These are good, godly men. Much of what they had to say was good Bible doctrine. For example, Eliphaz talks about we reap what we sow. Is that good Bible doctrine? Sure it is. He just made wrong application of that and took a leap from that to make the conclusion that Job then indeed is guilty of sin. So his first speech, that is Eliphaz, responds to Job's lamentation, and he basically said in his speech, Job, you reap what you sow. This doesn't happen to innocent people. So you've done something wrong. I don't know what it is, but you've done something wrong because you reap what you sow, and since you're reaping bad things, you've done some bad things. That's what you've done. Now we're ready for Job to speak. And so this is where we begin in our study tonight, looking at what Job had to say. So let's go to our questions for tonight and get some of those out of the way. Question number 1, who are the speakers in these chapters? That is 6, 7, 8, and 9. Job, Bildad, and then Job again. All right. So we have Job in chapter 6 and 7. We have Bildad in chapter 8. And then we have Job coming back again in chapter 9. Question number 3. Summarize Job's speech in 6 and 7. That is chapter 6 and chapter 7. What did he say? All right. Somewhat rambles. He does talk about wishing for death. What else? Before I say anything, let me hear what else. Yeah, good question. What have I done? Tell me what I've done. You're accusing me of wrong? That's a fair question. Tell me what I've done. Tell me the sin that I have committed. Anything else? All right. Even if I've done wrong, I need kindness and show some concern and some care. So Job basically says three things. And they're putting this little blurb at the top. My troubles are great. My friends are no help. And thirdly, I'm innocent. Now, what you're going to see with reference to Job is Job rambles more than the others. It seems like when the friends speak, Eliphaz, Bildad, or Zophar, that they have a target point they're making and they drive that point home. And then the next one speaks and he drives his point home. But Job, due to his suffering, they're not suffering. Now they hurt for their friend, all right, but they're not suffering like Job. They're not going through what Job goes through. So Job, though, because of his pain, because of his suffering and his agony, he rambles somewhat. And it's not always connecting thoughts. And we'll see some of that even in chapters 6 and 7. All right, let's go to question number 2. What does, therefore my words have been rash? What does that mean? Verse 3. All right, yeah, I say things that I don't, in my condition, that I don't necessarily mean. And we'll get to that here in just a second. So let's look at what he says. This is Job's speech now. He's going to start with, my troubles from God have been heavy. Let's talk about that. My troubles from God. This is in verses 1 to 7. We won't get every detail. But he said, oh, that my grief were fully weighed and the calamity were put on the balance. If you put it on a scale, it's going to tip the scale. If you put all my troubles, and so it's been very weighty. It would be heavier than the sand of the sea. That's a pretty strong statement. Therefore, my words have been rash. You might underline that. There's a lesson to be learned from that. Therefore, my words have been rash. What Job is saying is, can you three friends not understand that when you suffer like I suffer, that you're apt to say things that may be overstated and that you may not fully mean? How many times have you heard somebody say something in the midst of a tragedy or a trial where you felt like maybe I ought to respond to that and I ought to correct them in that, and maybe I need to back off correcting them for right now, because people who suffer will sometimes say things that are rash, and we need to recognize that. And he's trying to tell his friends, do you not get that? Yeah, I did say I wished I could die, and there's a sense in which I do, and I'm lashing out, but I'm suffering. Can you not understand that? That's a powerful lesson to learn right there. Now, verses 5 to 7, I want to notice, though, before we get to verse 5, you might underline the word arrows. For the arrows of the Almighty are within me. I think several times we'll see this, where Job basically says, God's shooting arrows at me. God's setting me up for target practice. Now, that doesn't justify Job. I'm not justifying Job at all. In fact, God's going to rebuke him later. But I think in essence he's saying that God set me up for target practice. He's shooting arrows at me. I don't understand what God's doing with me here. But anyway, let's start at verse 5. His point here is, this is the weight of my troubles are sickening to me. Now there's some question exactly what he means here. Let's look at verse 5. Does a wild donkey bray when it has grass? And the answer is no, he doesn't do that. In other words, the donkey that's got grass and got plenty to eat, he's not braying over there. The oxen doesn't low over his fodder. In other words, you don't hear the oxen carrying on when they have plenty to eat as well, when they're taken care of. In other words, I'm moaning and I'm groaning and I'm lashing out because I'm suffering. That's what's going on. Look at verse 6. Can flavorless food be eaten without salt? Let me back up to verse 5, this wild donkey and the ox. I think what he's saying is that my complaint is not for no reason. Yes, I've complained and lashed out in that lamentation of chapter 3. I did that. But it's not for no reason at all. There is a reason for that. Now, the question among commentators is at verse 6 and 7. Can flavorless food be eaten without salt? Or is there any taste in the white of an egg? But let's go back to the flavorless food. Can it be eaten without salt? Some suggest, and I want to lean this direction, that he's saying suffering and complaint go together like salt and tasteless food. That may be what he's saying. That if you have tasteless food, you need salt to make it palatable. They go hand in hand. And so it's the same thing is true with suffering and complaint. Yes, you're going to lash out and you're going to say things like that when you suffer. Haley thinks, Homer Haley that is, thinks that he's responding to Eliphaz and saying Eliphaz's speech was like flavorless food and like the white of an egg. and my soul refuses to touch them, and they are loathsome food to me. Maybe so. I'm not convinced. He says that better fits the context. I think the previous better fits the context, but I'll leave that for you to decide what you think about that. All right. Any questions so far? Now, verses 8 through 13, he basically says what? I wish that my God, oh, that I would make my request that give me what I long for God please to just crush me. In other words, I wish God would just cut me off. Look at the end of verse 9, that he would loose his hand to cut me off. I wish that's what God would do with me. What strength have I, I'm reading at verse 11, that I should have hope. That there's no hope that things are going to get better with me, and things are getting worse with me. This has gone on for perhaps months by this point. I know it went on for months, but I'm not sure at what point he said all of this. But he's basically saying, I wish God would just completely just cut me off. That sounds very similar to what we saw in chapter 3. Now let's talk about this rebuke of his friends. Now this is interesting. What does he say to his friends? Verse 14. All right. That to him who is afflicted, kindness should be shown to his friends, even if he forsakes God. You're saying I did wrong. I'm saying I'm innocent. But even if you're right in what you said, even if I have done wrong, a little kindness wouldn't have hurt for you to show to me when I'm suffering like this. I've lost my children, lost my health. I've lost all my possessions. They're very insensitive, by the way, to him. We're going to see more about that in our study tonight. Now, look at verse 15 to 21. He said, basically, you're no help. Later, he's going to call them worthless physicians. He said they were like a deceitful brook. What does he mean by that? It's a brook with no water. Picture yourself as needing water, maybe for your animal or for yourself, and you see that there's where the brook is supposed to be, and you get up there and it's all dry. It's a deceitful brook, a riverbed, and there's no water in that. He said, you come as friends and you're empty. You have nothing to offer to me. You have nothing that's helpful to me. You're like a deceitful brook. And talks about how they're disappointed, and at verse, the people who come to the deceitful brook, verse 20, are disappointed. Now look at verse 21. Here's another powerful lesson to learn. He said, for now you are nothing. You see terror and are afraid. What does he mean by that? Yeah. And that's part of the reason why they're accusing him of wrong. You see the point? If Job is innocent and he suffers like this, that means the same thing, finish my sentence, to Bildad, Eliphaz, and Zophar. Same thing could happen to them. But if in their mind they can think, you know what, he did something wrong, or his children did something wrong, and there's sin involved, and we know we haven't sinned like that, that makes them feel better. The same thing is not going to happen to them. So let's go to question number 5. In Job 6:21, Job seems to be making the point, if this happened to me while living right, that means it could happen to you too, and that makes you afraid. And let's list some present day application of that. What would you put? Yeah, bad things happen to righteous people. But when I see bad things happen, if I can, in my mind, I wonder what they did to cause that. Makes me feel better about myself, doesn't it? Because I don't want bad things to happen to me. So they must have done something to cause that. For example, what about someone's children turned to the world? They must have done something to cause that to happen, because I wouldn't want that to happen to me, so I'll know it won't happen to me because I'm not doing what I'm assuming they did. Does that make sense? You can think of another example. Question 5. Yeah. Someone dies young. They must not have taken care of themselves. I bet they did something, because I don't want that to happen to me. I'm taking care of myself. Anything else? Yes, ma'am. Good point. Good point. All right. Now look at verse 22 and 23. What does he say to his friends? This is another part of this rebuke. Tell me what I've done wrong. And did I ask anything of you? You came here when you heard about my problems, and did I ask you to bring me anything? Did I offer you a bribe? Did I ask you to deliver me from my enemy's hand? Did you do any? Did I ask for anything? Here's a practical thing to learn. When someone's suffering, they're not expecting you to explain why it's going on. We sometimes think we need to give an explanation to them, make them feel better. They didn't ask for an explanation. Job didn't ask for an explanation. He said, I didn't ask anything of you. I asked for nothing. I didn't ask for a thing. Now then, verses 24 to 26, he tells them, tell me now what I've done wrong. Look at verse 25. This is a key to what Job says all through the book. What does he say? Yeah, teach me. Cause me to understand wherein I have erred. How forceful are the right words, but what does your arguing prove? In other words, you've provided no proof. You've not told me what I've done. If you reprove my words, they are as wind. In other words, you're responding to me and reproving me, but one thing you haven't done is you tell me what I did wrong. That's one thing you haven't done. You haven't done that at all. Now look at verse 27. He says something else to them. You overwhelm the fatherless and undermine your friend. What does that mean?
Too much.
You're too much. You're heartless. You don't seem to care. In other words, you come and dump your load of guilt on me when I haven't done it, and you won't even tell me what I did wrong, and you basically are indeed heartless. Now look at verse 28, 29, and 30. That'll finish that chapter. Job does this time and again. He basically makes the claim, I am innocent. Look at verse 28. For I would never lie to you. Turn now. Let there be no injustice. Yes, turn again. My righteousness still stands. I'm innocent. I'm telling you I'm innocent. I tell you I haven't done a thing wrong. And if I have, tell me what it is. That's a fair question. All right. Now let's go to chapter 7. He continues his speech. There's no real break. So in chapter 7, verses 1 to 10, his point there is that life is hard and painful. I told you Job kind of rambles. He lashes at his friends. He sometimes will turn and talk to God. He talks about himself. He just kind of rambles around in his speech. Well, you would too, perhaps, in this condition. Look at verses 1 to 5. What does he say? He basically says, I'm looking for some relief. I'm looking for some rest. I'm like a man that's worked hard all day. I'm like a servant that's looking for shade. I'm like a hired man looking eagerly for his wages. When I lie down, I say, when shall I rise and the night be ended? And he talks about tossing and turning. I'll come back to verse 5 just a moment, talking about his health. But basically he says, I'm looking for some rest. I lay down at night and I can't sleep. I'm just looking for some rest and some relief from my problem. Here's how bad it is. Look at verse 5. My flesh is caked with worms and dust. My skin is cracked and breaks out afresh. Whatever this is, Job has boils. He's covered with worms, and he's open wounds that are bursting open and cracked open, and he's got oozing from his wounds. Job indeed is suffering. Now, let's talk about 6 to 10. This is something true of all of us. What does he say in 6 to 10? Yeah, life is swifter than a weaver's shuttle. And my eyes shall never see any good. No, he said, my life is passing by. I think that's his point. I don't think he's just merely saying life is passing fast. But my life is passing by. And notice this phrase at verse 7, my eye will never again see good. What does he mean, you think, in light of what he's been saying?
You don't see light at the end of the tunnel. You don't see no way out.
There's no hope. Yeah, it's not going to get any better. It does get better, but he doesn't know that. His friends are telling me it's going to get better. They don't know that either. But Job says, I don't see that it's getting any better. I just think things are not going to get any better. My eye sees no good. The eye of him who sees me will see me no more. In other words, I'm fading fast. Notice it, verse 10, he shall never return to his house. He goes down to the grave, never return again to his house, and nor shall his place know him anymore. In other words, I'm fading away, and things are going fast. Now, to end his speech, let's get through with chapter 7. Here's his complaint against God. I told you he rambles, so here is where he has been talking to his friends. He talks about himself, and now he turns and talks to God. And he's got a complaint against God. Now, God's going to later rebuke him. I remember my first serious study of this, I kept thinking, is Job right in this? Because Job's a righteous man, and Job is mentioned as a patient man. But God rebukes him later for this. So we don't need to think Job's justified in all that he says. So now what does he say here? In verse 12. He said he's not going to restrain. He's going to speak in the anguish of his spirit, and I'll complain in the bitterness of my soul. I'm going to lash out, and I'm going to let my complaint be known. I'm hurting. But he raises this question at verse 12. Am I a sea or a sea serpent, that you should set your guard over me? In other words, am I one that has to be watched, that you're guarding over me? In other words, why have you set your guard over me? Why am I under your guard? Why are you watching me so closely? God, why are you doing to me what you're doing? I think it seems to be his question. What else does he say? 13 and 14 together. When I go to bed, that's where you go for comfort, to lie down and rest and get some comfort. And he said, but when I go there, you chase me with dreams. In other words, nightmares. And so I have dreams and nightmares, and you scare me in my dreams. And so he blames that on God. And so he has terrors in the night. So he makes a plea to God, verse 16, I loathe my life. I would not live forever, let me alone. In other words, I really don't want to keep living. I don't think Job is contemplating suicide, but I wished I could just die now. He'd already said that in chapter 3, that it is so terrible I just wished I could die. I wished I could just go. I wish God would just go ahead and just let me alone and let me die, I think is his point in verse 16. Now, let's get 17 to 19. He raises a question. Again, this is part of this rambling. I wished I could die, and then he turns a question back to God. What's his question? How long are you going to let this go on? Why do you continually test man? What is man that you should magnify him and set your heart on him, that you should visit him every morning and test him every moment? You're testing me. You're putting me you're putting me under the gun. And why are you doing this every day with me? When's this going to end? And then at verse 20, he raises a question. This seems to be directed toward God and not to his friends. We'd already asked this of his friends. What's his question to God? Have I sinned? And if so, what? In other words, is this because I've done wrong? Is this because of sin? Verse 20, have I sinned? What have I done, O watcher of men? Why have you set me as your target? You might underline that again. That's the second time we've seen that. God set him up for target practice, he says. And so why are you targeting me? Why are you doing that to me? And so verse 21, he says, why not just pardon me? If I've done wrong and I'm not told what I've done, why not forgive me? I'm wanting to know what I've done wrong. Now, he makes a statement right at the end. This is interesting. He said, for now I will lie down in the dust, and you will seek me diligently, but I will no longer be. What does that say? Do what? Maybe. Seems like he later indicates that. I think he's saying, when I'm gone from this life, you're not going to have me to kick around anymore. Because he's accused God of targeting him. And why are you doing this to me? Well, just leave me alone. You pursue me in my dreams. You're continually testing me. If I sin, why haven't you revealed to me what I've done? Why don't you just forgive me? I'm going to lie down in the dust, and I'm going to be no more. And you will seek me diligently, but I will be no longer. You're not going to have me to kick around anymore. You ever feel that way when you feel like you've been abused, maybe on a job or maybe it's family or whatever, and I'm going to be gone one of these days, and you're not going to have me to kick around anymore? That seems to be what Job is saying here at verse 21. Well, he's through with this speech now. So what did he say? Well, basically, I have great troubles. My friends have been no help. I'm innocent. Y'all are heartless. Life is just terrible. It's hard and painful. And he turns and complains to God. Now we're ready for Bildad to speak. Questions on Job's speech, 6 and 7. Yeah, we might be rambling much worse than that. Any questions or comments? Chapter 6 and 7. Let's go to our questions and look at question number 4. Summarize Bildad's speech in chapter 8. Yeah. How long are you going to keep denying this? You know you did wrong. So it's time to fess up. Yeah. You're a sinner, and what this is punishment. That's basically what his speech says. If I wanted to summarize it, that's basically, it's time to, how long is this going to keep going on? All right. I didn't mean to do that. 5 things he says here. Let's start with verses 1 and 2. This is not a long speech that he makes. His first question is at verse 2. How long will you speak these things? And the words of your mouth like strong wind. In other words, you're just blowing hot air. That's what he's saying. And how long are you going to just keep just barking this thing out about you being innocent? You know you've done wrong. How long is this going to go on? Now, notice in verses 3 and 4, we've already noted that Eliphaz, I want to take note of this, that Eliphaz earlier in chapter 5 had, or actually chapter 4, that Eliphaz had shown some insensitivity, and Job pointed that out in chapter 5 rather. This was Eliphaz, I'm sorry. Eliphaz in chapter 5 in verse 25 that God's going to give you more children. How insensitive that was. We're going to see his insensitivity right here. Notice at verses 3 and 4 now of chapter 8 what he says. Does God subvert judgment, or does the Almighty pervert justice? And here's where he's insensitive. If your sons have sinned against him, he has cast them away for their transgression. Remember, he lost his children. And he says to them, now Eliphaz has already said, well, God will bless you with more children. So God will bless you. You just repent and you're going to have more children. And that was very insensitive. But now he's saying, Bildad is saying, your children were probably killed because of some sin they committed. Now, how would you like that to be standing at the funeral home over the casket of your children and someone come and put their arm around you? I bet they did something wrong. I bet they sinned, and that's why God took them. That's what it was. I'm sure it was. How insensitive that was. He cast them away for that. And so they've done something wrong. So this is just. God is just because this is punishment for sin is what this is. That's the main part of his speech. Now then, verses 5 to 7, what does he tell him to do? Yeah, if you will earnestly seek God, that's an accusation. You're not seeking God, and make your supplication to the Almighty. In other words, just repent of what you've done. They haven't one time told him, here's what you have done. You've stolen, or you've been unfaithful to your wife, or you've murdered, or what. They haven't charged him with a thing except it's just general sin. So if you will earnestly seek God. Now notice, though your beginning was small, your latter end will increase abundantly. That's true, but Bildad has no way of knowing that. God does bless him abundantly at the end. But Bildad has no way of knowing that any more than you do. If you talk to somebody you think is sin, if you turn back to God, you're going to have an abundance of blessings. God's going to richly bless you. And you're going to have more children, you're going to have wealth, you're going to have et cetera. You have no way of knowing that. They didn't either. Now look at that gets us through verse 7. At verse 8 to 18, what's his point? Yeah. Sinners don't prosper. And so, Job, you're not prospering. Therefore, you're a sinner. Let's stop and footnote here just for a moment. I'll come back to verse 8 to 18. All through these speeches, basically, they go to Job and picture this as if it's a mirror. And they don't literally have a mirror, but it's almost as if they are taking a mirror and say, Job, I want to show you what a sinner's like. And they hold a mirror in front of his face. And does that look like you? Well, then you're a sinner. That's like me walking up to you and describing, I'll tell you what, a sinner is a person who has this color hair and has on this color clothes and wears glasses or doesn't wear glasses, whatever, and it describes you to the T. And so does that fit you? Then you got to be a sinner. That's what you are. Job, you're a sinner because sinners suffer. So therefore, you must be a sinner. That's their point. So notice in verses 8 to 18, they do that all through their speeches. Beginning at verse 8, inquire of the former age and consider the things discovered by their fathers. But we were but of yesterday and know nothing, because our days of the earth are a shadow. And will they not teach you and tell you in other words of your heart? In other words, you're going to learn by going back and talk to our ancestors, our fathers, etc. Can the papyrus grow without a marsh and reeds flourish without water? And the answer to that, of course, no, they can't do that. Now look at verse 13. Here's the application. So the paths of all who forget God and the hope of a hypocrite. So what they're saying to Job is that it may be, you're saying you haven't done anything wrong. Maybe you haven't revealed that, but maybe you're a hypocrite. You see, maybe you haven't openly done something where we can see it, but you must be a hypocrite. That may be where the problem is. So the person that forgets God and the person that's a hypocrite is going to perish. They don't prosper. Whose confidence shall be cut off and whose trust is a spider's web. In other words, their house is going to fail and be as frail as a spider's web. It's frail. It doesn't hold anything. It has no strength. So you've probably been a hypocrite, and your house is crumbling is what it's doing. You've built a house that's as weak as a spider's web is what you've done, Job. What have you done? I don't know, because you're a hypocrite. You're hiding it is what you're doing. And you're leaning on a house that won't stand, verse 15. Now notice at verse 18 to finish that section before we go to verse 19. If he is destroyed from his place, then it will deny him, saying, I have not seen you. In other words, where he put his confidence, he's being rejected. You put your confidence in something, his hypocrisy perhaps, and it's failing with you. And so that's a pretty strong statement. Instead of saying, Job, we think what you did was X, Y, Z, then we think you're a hypocrite and you've hit it. We don't know what it is, but you've done something wrong. Now let's get 19 to 22 to finish Bildad before we go to Job. What does he say here in 19 to 22? Yeah, based on assumption. This is all assumption. God wouldn't be treating you this way if you hadn't done anything wrong. God doesn't cast away the blameless. God will not cast away the blameless, verse 20, nor will he uphold the evildoer. So that's an assumption that righteous people never suffer. And that's all an assumption. That's not true. We do reap what we sow, that's true, but that is an assumption based at verse 20. And yet, go ahead.
The hedge that Satan used God to put.
Yeah.
There ain't no hedge around.
No, there hadn't been a hedge. But Satan thought there was and accused him of that. Absolute. Good point. All right, any questions down through the end of chapter 8? I'm going to finish up with chapter 9. Bildad's speech. Basically, you're a sinner. This is punishment. God doesn't punish people who didn't sin. You did sin. And probably you're a hypocrite. It's really what it is. Yes, sir, Mike.
That's the attitude that a lot of people have. You listen to lament. Something good will happen today. You do this, do that.
If you give.
God bless you. They need to understand what Solomon said in Ecclesiastes. Those things happen by chance.
Absolutely.
Just like fishing for a fish. How did that fish get caught one next to a fish?
Just by chance. Yeah.
The Lord said, I said, rain on just and
Absolutely.
both good.
Yeah. Good point. Very good point. Tim?
His friends never say that Satan is trial you. They always say that God has punished you.
Yeah.
But they don't look at it from the aspect that
Yeah.
everything that's happened to Job is coming from the evil one. Yes, it's evil, but the wrong person is caused his dilemma. And they never realize, I think, that the devil is actually doing all this to Job instead of God.
Job doesn't see that, nor do the friends see that. God never reveals that to them. And that's part of the beauty of the book, is that they never see fully that picture. All right, let's go to chapter 9. Let's go to Job's speech in chapter 9. And this goes in 9 and 10. We won't get to 10, so we've kind of graded that out, and we'll get to that next time. But we're going to look at the first 7 points here. So Job now is responding to Bildad. And often he responds to the person who just spoke, but really he's talking to all of his friends, because they've all seem to be in agreement. Job, you've done something wrong. So here's his response to that. Verses 1 to 13, how can one receive justice from God? So if you wanted to summarize his speech, there's 2 things. How do you receive justice? And I'm innocent. That's what he's saying. So let's look at verse 3 of chapter 9. If I wish to contend, speaking of God, if I wish to contend with him, if I wish to argue with him, he could not answer him 1 time out of 1,000. What's he saying here? All right, yeah. Who is man to argue and defend himself against God? And so Job is saying, I can't receive justice from God. I'm unjustly suffering, is Job's picture of this. I'm unjustly suffering. And so if I take my case to God, how can I argue with God about that? And then he talks about the greatness and the terror of God. We're not that this is unimportant, but I'm just going to hit some high points. That he talks about God is wise. He removes the mountains, verse 5. He overturns them in his anger, and he shakes the earth. This seems to be a doxology here. And so he just runs through this, basically this song. He alone spreads the heavens, verse 8. He created the Orion and Pleiades and the Bear, etc. And the clusters of stars and the galaxies. He created all of that. And on down the line till we get down to verse 13. And God will not withdraw his anger. And the allies of the proud lie prostrate beneath him. In other words, what's he saying? Well, he's just praising God for his greatness and his terror. Here's what I'm learning from that. Through all of Job's suffering, he lashes out at God and accuses God of setting him up for target practice, but Job never, ever loses his faith in God. That's an important point. We're going to see that in chapter 19. Chapter 19, he declares it's greater than in any other chapter. If you had to pick a chapter that's the pinnacle of the book, it'd be chapter 19, verse 25, 26, 27, right in there. Anyway, that's this great declaration of faith. That's the pinnacle of the book. But anyway, I'm learning from this, he never loses his faith in God. Does he lash out at God? Yes, but he never lost his faith in God. God is great, God is wonderful, etc., etc., etc. Now then, let's go back now to verse 14 to 20. He raises the question, who can argue with God? How can I answer him and choose my words to reason with him? For though I were righteous, I could not answer him, and I beg for mercy. For he crushes me, verse 17, with a tempest and multitudes of wounds without cause. God has given me problems without cause. How do you reason with God? How do you argue with God? How do I take my case before God? I said Job was rambling. That seems to be rambling. He talks about how great God is, and then who can argue with God? Comes back 9 and 21. What does he say in 9 and 21? I'm blameless, yet I do not know myself. I despise my life. I'm blameless. I've done no wrong, and yet I'm innocent, though, he's saying. I'm innocent. Look at 22 to 24. It is all one thing. Verse 20, we have a question on this, I think. Therefore I say he destroys the blameless and the wicked. Question number, whatever that is, 7. What's his point? All right, they both suffer together. Job seems to be saying, in light of his complaint against God, there's no justice here. There seems to be no justice, but one suffers like the other. It's all one thing. He destroys the blameless and the wicked. Everybody suffers. It is not just the wicked that suffers, the blameless suffer. Job's going to make that point time and again. He ratchets that up a little bit, in his later speeches. Now notice at verse, let's see, our time is about gone. Let's go down to verse 25 and 26. My days are brief, is his point. My days are swifter than a runner. They pass like the swift ship and like an eagle swooping on its prey. Some commentators suggest an eagle could swoop down at speeds of over 100 miles an hour. In other words, my life is just passing by quickly. Now, at verse 27 to 31, if I strive to be pure, which he has been doing, look at verse 28, you will not hold me innocent. He's lashing back out at God. I do what's right, and yet you treat me like I've done wrong. Do you think Job's friends are having any impact on him of his thinking? He stands his ground, but he lashes at God like God's punishing him, doesn't he? That I'm not held as innocent. You're treating me like I've done wrong. Maybe they are having some impact on his thinking. I'm not sure. Look at verse 32 to 35 to finish that. That when I'm trying to live like I'm living, what's his point? That God's not like a man. If I had a difference with a man, yeah. If I had a problem with another man that we could, and he's my equal, then we could resolve it. We'd have a mediator, an umpire, we'd have a judge, we could settle that. But if I have a problem with God, where do I go? Where do I go? And so is Job saying things? Remember he's saying at chapter 6, my words are rash. Some of them are. Some of them are. And we can understand that. And so Job is saying, how can I receive justice? I'm innocent. Now, let's get a little glimpse of where we're going in chapter 10, and we're going to stop for practical things in our times about God. He's going to ask God, what do you have against me to torment me? And then he comes back to this thing of, I just wish I could die. And Job indeed is suffering. All right, practical lessons. Question number 8, I think it is. What practical things do we take home with us? So let's get 2 or 3 or 4 out of this, and then we're going to stop. Good point. People with good intentions give bad advice. Good point.
If people are really suffering, pointing out their wrongs right at that time is not the thing to do.
That's a good point. That maybe they do need some correction, but not right then. That can wait. And Job, in essence, has told them that. What else? Take home practical. Say again? Yeah, how true. What we believe may not be necessarily what's true. This is what they thought. Do you think they were sincere? I think Job's friends were sincere. They were just absolutely wrong about Job being a sinner. Anything else? Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, I learned a lesson about being kind to those even those who've done wrong, chapter 6 and 14. And just remember, those who suffer sometimes will say things they don't mean. And Job also makes this point that I think he's trying to tell his friends, you don't understand how heavy my burden is. And we may not always understand the weight of the burden some people are carrying. They may be suffering far more than we think and more than we realize. We'll pick up with chapter 10 next time.